this first talk, I'm going to talk about self-esteem, and I'm naming this talk What Everyone Needs to Know About the Dangers of Artificial Self-Esteem Building. And to some extent, I have to give some credit to the world's most distinguished psychologist currently, Martin Seligman, Professor Martin Seligman. I had him over at an event in Glasgow in 2003. I had written a book called The Scots Crisis of Confidence, and he said to me at one point privately, look, great what you're doing on confidence, but be very careful you do not go down the self-esteem route, because it's toxic. And actually just about every American psychologist that we subsequently had over, and we did have a number of American psychologists come and give talks for us, said very similar things. Now, I'm not the kind of person that immediately says, oh, you're right, Marty. You know, I had to think about what was the dangers of self-esteem. I wasn't a psychologist myself. I wasn't aware of some of this literature. But I paid attention, and I paid attention partly because Scotland was now at a position where we were spending a lot of time thinking about confidence because of the curriculum for excellence. And I had a look at some of the research and writing on self-esteem in America, and it did give me some cause for concern. And I often give talks on it because I think it's of such fundamental importance to parents, to teachers, to anyone working with young people, that they understand some of this cultural shift that's taken place and how we've been influenced in our thinking. And it really goes back to the self-esteem movement in America in the 1980s, where people started to say that just about everything to do with young people would be improved if we could boost their self-esteem. So they would get jobs, there wouldn't be teenage pregnancy, they wouldn't take alcohol, they wouldn't take drugs if they had higher self-esteem. I mean, one critic once said everything other than verruca and acne and dandruff was going to be improved by self-esteem building. The problem for the self-esteem movement at that point was that there wasn't a great deal of evidence to corroborate what they were saying, but they were convinced. And in fact, once they did commission some research and it came in and it showed that it wasn't actually as important as they were saying, they thought the research was wrong. And that's always the danger if you fundamentally believe you're right, that you don't actually pay attention to the empirical evidence. There's a psychologist called Roy Baumeister, and he decided that he was going to find the evidence because he was a fan of self-esteem. He thought it was really important, but he was a very, very good researcher. One of the problems with the self-esteem research is to do with what people with high self-esteem say. So for example, if you ask people to rate their self-esteem and rate their looks, it looks like people with high self-esteem are good looking and that they're clever and that they have a lot of friends. But actually, if you ask other people to rate people's looks, what you find is that that link disappears. In other words, people with high self-esteem make a lot of claims for themselves that may or may not be true. So Roy Baumeister really kind of eliminated the studies that weren't corroborated in that way. And what he then ended up saying after he did this research is that the research he did in self-esteem was the biggest disappointment of his professional life. Because not only could he not justify the idea that self-esteem was a panacea, he actually concluded that high self-esteem was a bigger social problem than low self-esteem. And very, very similar research was done in Britain by another psychologist called Professor Nicholas Emler. And he wrote a book called The Costs and Causes of Low Self-Worth. And he concluded the same thing. And part of the issue, and I don't really have time to go into the nuts and bolts of this, but what they're saying is, yes, low self-esteem is a factor for things like teenage pregnancy, for what we would consider the NEAT group, but it's only one risk factor amongst many. It matters much more whether you're poor, whether your father works. These kind of socioeconomic factors are more important than the self-esteem factors. What they also found is that people who are bullies, for example, people who are prejudiced, people who are racist, often score high in self-esteem, not low. And what they were concluding is that people with low self-esteem often damage themselves. People with high self-esteem, and it could be false high self-esteem, I mean, I think this is one of the arguments, but nonetheless can actually be quite prejudiced about other people. And what I concluded from this is it's a very, very complicated area. And I think I would agree with Seligman when he says that you do not want to try and artificially boost the self-esteem of people who've already got quite high self-esteem and, as your grannies would say, have a big tip for themselves.